Hey everyone, welcome to the Nerd Talk Podcast. I'm your host Nick Leland, and in this series I take a few minutes to recommend a movie for you guys. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about Universal's 1931 movie, Dracula. Dracula stars Bela Lugosi as the famous vampire who travels from Transylvania to England to prey on new victims. Now, this movie is important for many reasons. For one, it was Universal's first film in their famous monster movie franchise that lasted from the 30s all the way through the 40s. And these movies were the ones that ingrained the popular images of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman, for example, into the public eye. And the popular image of Dracula we can thank from the performance of Bela Lugosi, who does an amazing job in this movie, and it's one of those performances where he instantly earns your attention wherever he appears, with the way he portrays the vampire as a sophisticated gentleman who knows how to gain the trust of everyone and prey on his victims. Now, one reason I'd say his performance is so good is because he had a lot of practice. You see, before he played Dracula on the movie screen, he played him on the stage from 1927 all the way until Universal announced their adaptation in 1930. And when they did, he campaigned hard to earn it, and it shows that Dracula always meant a lot to him, and almost 100 years later, he is still the definitive image of this character. And there's a few other performances that stand out in this film, of course. Dwight Frye, for instance, is well casted as his servant Renfield, and he goes from a standard businessman going to meet Dracula for a deal to becoming his bargaining slave. And it's a really sympathetic but also over-the-top performance where you see his wide stare when he looks to the camera or when he's looking at people, and you see how Dracula has just driven him mad to the point that he will do anything for the man. Now, this film I also think has a great gothic atmosphere, which also helped to influence horror movies for the next couple of decades at least. Some scenes that come to mind, for examples, are when Dracula bites Lucy and Mina when the smoke fills the room and he's standing over them. It's this, again, very mysterious atmosphere, especially when he puts his cape over them and it cuts right before you actually get to see whatever it is he's going to do. Now, while I do have much to praise this movie for, I also think that it's important to talk about its problems. And to say this movie isn't perfect, I'd say it's an understatement, and trust me, since it's over a century old, that's only to be expected, but it's still important that we address it. My first problem I want to address with Dracula is, aside from Swan Lake in the opening credits and the music in the Opera House where we meet our main cast of characters, there's no soundtrack for this film, and one reason for this was there were still theaters at the time which didn't have the equipment for sound film, so they were still showing silent versions of this movie for those theaters to be able to run it. And again, while I think it offers a more eerie and gothic atmosphere for the film, I can see why it would make some people bored watching this. And fortunately, most copies of this movie, at least the ones that I know, come with an optional score that was composed by Philip Glass, and it's a really good one. So there's still an option for people who would have a problem with this movie's lack of a score, but again, just something I think everyone should know going in. Now, my second problem with this movie is, aside from Lugosi and Frye's performances, along with a couple others in this film, the rest of the acting is either fine or just forgettable. And again, it's something that makes this film feel like it drags on way more than it should at times. And the prime example I think of this is David Banner's performance in this film, because this is basically what his performance is like in the movie. What's that? Running across the lawn. It's like a huge dog. You know, it's just this very bland and forgettable performance. And on one hand, you want to forgive them because this was just a few years after the transition from silent films to talkies began. But on the other hand, Universal seemingly fixed many of these problems with Frankenstein just a few months later, and that movie, at least in my humble opinion, is much more fast-paced, and everyone feels much more comfortable with being on the screen. But again, for all its flaws that I just mentioned, I don't think this movie is bad. It, again, laid the groundwork for Universal's monster franchise for the next 2 decades at least. Lugosi's performance helped popularize Dracula in the public eye, and I'd still argue it's one that holds up almost 100 years later. But again, I definitely understand why someone genuinely wouldn't like this movie. And that's all I have to say for Universal's adaptation of Dracula. Before I go, I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Nerd Talk Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a thumbs up button. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to let me know your thoughts of this movie if you've seen it in the comments below, or let me know your favorite Universal monster movie. And until next time, my name is Nick Leland. Thank you again for listening to the Nerd Talk Podcast, and I hope you have a great day.